What's good? It's Wood. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We've got Jermell Charlo, 34 wins and 1 loss, defending his WBA, WBC, and IBF and ring light middleweight, junior middleweight, 154-pound titles against Brian Castano, 17 wins, 0 losses, and 1 draw, who will be defending his WBO junior middleweight title. All 4 major belts on the line. That's right, this is a unification match to determine the undisputed champion at 154. I love it when people try to make history. I love it when people challenge themselves. This is a perfect example of that. And it just so happens to work out because both Charlo and Castano fight under the PBC banner. So this is one of the divisions where that works out. You know, when PBC announced their summer lineup of fights, this fight between Jermell Charlo and Brian Castano was the one that I had rated the highest matchups wise. And this included, Gervonta Davis versus Mario Barrios and Nonito Donaire versus Ubali. And this was obviously before the Manny Pacquiao versus Errol Spence super fight was announced. But looking at this Jermell Charlo versus Brian Castano matchup, this battle for undisputed, there was once kind of an identity crisis in terms of determining what was what and who was who in terms of the Charlo brothers. I mean, some knew from the get, and then some had to kind of grow to know them a little bit better as they have continued to see them fight over the years. They were once both at 154, and Jermell was probably kind of viewed as being slightly better than Jermell. At 154, I mean, Jermell was the one who knocked out Julian J. Rock Williams, Cornelius K9 Bundridge. Meanwhile, Jermell Charlo was kind of more of a slicker boxer, at least when you're talking, 2013, 2014, 2015. He was beating Vanes Martirosyan via decision, Gabriel Rosado via decision. Both Martirosyan and Gabriel Rosado are former title challengers. Rosado challenged up as high as 160 and has since fought at 168. But Jermell Charlo was a very good round winner and was winning a lot of his fights via decision. It really wasn't until he fought Yoshim Alcine and then John Jackson where he started scoring some pretty spectacular knockouts. And, he struggled big time with John Jackson. He knocked him out in the 8th round, but he was having a lot of difficulty and was giving up a lot of those rounds. Well, around the same time, Jermell Charlo leaves 154, goes to 160, fights basically, non-elite 160 guys for his first 5 or so fights, and then fights Derevianchenko, and then we recently seen him against Montiel just a few weeks ago. And Jermell Charlo is still undefeated. Jermell Charlo, after coming from behind to knock out John Jackson, he knocks out Charles Hatley in the middle rounds. And then he has a fight with Erickson Lubin, who was one of the most hyped prospects coming up. And he was super young. He fought Jermell Charlo when he was like 21, 22 years old. So this was kind of seen to be like a big time showdown. Jermell Charlo at this time is just the WBC champ, and then Erickson Lubin is the challenger. It was pretty much anybody's guess as to who was going to win the fight. Well, I'll stop short of saying anybody's guess because, I felt that it was way too soon for Erickson Lubin to fight somebody the caliber of Jermell Charlo. I mean, Lubin appeared to be on his way to being a title holder in some capacity, but he fights Jermell Charlo, and in the first round, Lubin ducks right into a Jermell Charlo low right hand power shot, puts Erickson Lubin on the canvas where he fell face and shoulder first, arm stiffened. It took him a while to even gather his senses to even attempt to get back up, because for a while he was just rocking awkwardly, one of those I can't control my body types of moments in the ring. This was an electrifying knockout win, first round knockout for Jermell Charlo, probably the crown jewel of his career up to this point. And keep in mind, he had beaten Martirosyan and Gabe Rosado already. So after that beautiful knockout win over Erickson Lubin, Jermell Charlo then fights a majority decision win over Austin Trout. Austin Trout, former champ at 154. He's beaten, for instance, Miguel Cotto when Cotto first went to 154. Austin Trout is one of those guys who only the elite level fighters are able to handle and beat. Kind of becoming one of those, near elite gatekeepers of the division. Well, after that decision win over Austin Trout, who has now lost to both Jermell and Jermell Charlo, Jermell Charlo fights Tony Harrison, who at the time was 27-2. Those two losses coming to Willie Nelson in 2015, and then in a vacant IBF title shot at 154, Tony Harrison lost via 9th round TKO to Jarrett Hurd, a former longtime champ of the division and kind of seen to be one of the division's absolute best, until he got beat by Julian J-Rock Williams, and then more recently to Luis Arias on that Floyd Mayweather versus Logan Paul undercard. Well, Jermell Charlo fights Tony Harrison on the same night that Jermell Charlo fought Matt Korobov. Both of the Charlo brothers were really in for it on that night, and I actually thought Jermell Charlo should have lost, or maybe a draw, versus Matt Korobov. Jermell Charlo scored the win via decision, but Jermell Charlo wasn't so lucky. He suffered his first loss via unanimous decision against Tony Harrison that night. I actually thought Jermell Charlo should have eked out a close decision victory, but it wasn't to be. They granted Tony Harrison with the win. So Jermell Charlo now doesn't have a WBC belt, and he has a loss on his record. Well, he returned about 6 months later to fight Jorge Cota, knocked him out in the 3rd round, and then later that year, 2019, he has a rematch against Tony Harrison, and round by round, he actually looked a lot worse in the Tony Harrison rematch than he did in the first fight, which again was super competitive, and he wasn't given the win, he being Jermell Charlo. In the rematch, he did knock Tony Harrison down in the 2nd round, but look, I had Tony Harrison winning the 3rd round, 4th, 5th, probably the 6th, 7th. Like, he was really winning this fight, in my opinion, by several rounds. And even from the unofficial judges' scorecard, Harrison was convincingly winning that fight, early knockdown aside. Well, Tony Harrison was getting too comfortable, started dropping his hands, started showboating a little bit, but Jermell Charlo, with a little bit of desperation, started really pouring it on in the 10th and then especially in the 11th round, where he caught Harrison, dropped him, knocked him down a 2nd time, and then just let his hands go with Harrison in the corner to where Jack Reese, the ref at the time, stopped the fight. Huge, dramatic, come-from-behind win for Jermell Charlo, earns that WBC belt back, avenges his only loss. Heartbreaking loss for Tony Harrison, who, he had it. He was right there. Well, to the victor go the spoils. Jermell Charlo then fights Jason Rosario, who was just coming off the win of his life, versus Julian J-Rock Williams, who won the belts off of Jarrett Hurd. So J-Rock Williams defends his WBA and IBF belts and the ring belt, unofficial but very credible ring belt, against Jason Rosario. Jason Rosario, a hard-hitting, puncher who could hit hard with both hands, a little bit reckless at times, but throws a bomb of a right hand, upsets Julian J-Rock Williams, takes the WBA and IBF titles, and then Jermell Charlo fights Jason Rosario with Jermell Charlo's WBC belt on the line and Rosario's WBA and IBF titles and ring unofficial title on the line. This fight took place during the pandemic, and this was the first time that the Charlo brothers headed a pay-per-view card, September of 2020. And this night, Jermell Charlo has the most impressive win of his career against Sergey Derevianchenko, who gave Triple G hell in a close decision loss for Derevianchenko. But this same night, as Jermell Charlo versus Derevianchenko, Jermell Charlo fights Jason Rosario, and this is a super contested bout. Another close fight for Jermell Charlo, where it's kind of give or take in terms of who's winning what rounds. They're kind of backing each other up. There are ebbs and flows in this one. Jason Rosario brings the heat. almost every bit as much as Jermell Charlo does. So there were moments where Jermell Charlo started looking good, working behind a jab and kind of picking his power shots and catching Jason Rosario, but then Jason Rosario would come back and throw some bombs, kind of back Jermell Charlo up. Super entertaining fight. And then Jermell Charlo hurts Jason Rosario in like the 7th round with a headshot to the side of the head, totally messes up Rosario's equilibrium, and then finishes him in the next round with a super weird, it was like a double jab to the body, but it wasn't even like a particularly stiff jab. He basically touched Jason Rosario to the belly. Rosario goes down and is just writhing in pain. Looks like he can't breathe for almost a minute long, to where he needed medical attention. He's just on the ground. It was weird. He was obviously winded, but it looked like there could have been additional internal damage or something done, because if you rewatch that knockdown, it not only does the punch that knocked him down look a little bit bizarre in that it wasn't like a scorching power shot, at least to the naked eye, but Jason Rosario is just in all kinds of dire straits. The fight's over. Jermell Charlo does it again. A mid to late round stoppage over Jason Rosario. He now has the WBC belt, the WBA belt, and the IBF belt, as well as the ring belt. And now he's bringing them into a undisputed unification fight against Brian Castano from Argentina, who's got a beautiful amateur pedigree. Not that Jermell Charlo is any amateur slouch. I believe Jermell Charlo, at the age of 15 years old, won the Junior Olympics back in like 2005, and then he turned pro. But Brian Castano basically won the South American Games gold medal. Not the Olympic Games, but the South American Games. And Brian Castano ended up with like an amateur record of 181 wins, 5 losses, 5 draws. Excellent amateur career. And he even beat Errol Spence Jr., the current IBF and WBC 147-pound champ right now. Brian Castano beat Spence in the amateurs, and then when he then participated in the World Series of Boxing, which isn't quite amateur but also not quite pro officially, Brian Castano famously beat Sergey Derevianchenko, the same guy who Jermell Charlo beat in a recent fight. Sergey Derevianchenko was undefeated in that World Series of Boxing competition. So Brian Castano was about as good as it comes as an amateur, then turns pro shortly after that win over Derevianchenko. He's now, as I mentioned, 17-0 with 1 draw. That 1 draw was about 3 fights ago against Erislandy Lara, the former longtime WBA champ, basically one of the best 154-pounders of his and the following generation. I remember several years ago, Erislandy Lara got upset against Paul the Punisher Williams, after Paul the Punisher Williams, who's now in a wheelchair because of a devastating motorcycle accident. Paul Williams was a bad boy. Dimensionally, he was a nightmare for a lot of opponents. He beat Antonio Margarito way before Manny Pacquiao or Shane Mosley did. Well, Erislandy Lara, nicknamed the American Dream, fought Paul Williams. To my eyes, beat Paul Williams, but Paul Williams was given the decision. Erislandy Lara would then later on go on to become the WBA 154-pound champ, defended it successfully several times against Delvin Rodriguez, Vanes Martirosyan, Ishe Smith, Yuri Foreman, Terrell Goucher. Lara also had a super close fight against Canelo Alvarez. To this day, that fight's largely disputed. There are many people who feel like Erislandy Lara won that fight against Canelo, but Canelo won a split decision win. So Erislandy Lara is about as real as they come at 154 for several years. And then in 2018, so he won that WBA title 2014, held on to it for 4 years, eventually loses it to Jarrett Hurd in a great fight. Split decision win for Jarrett Hurd. Great fight. The IBF title was on the line, Jarrett Hurd's IBF title. So that's how Jarrett Hurd won those titles that he later lost to Julian J. Rock Williams, who then lost those to Jason Rosario, who then lost those to Jermell Charlo. So then Lara, after the loss to Hurd, fights Brian Castano, who was coming in with a WBA lesser belt. And this Brian Castano versus Erislandy Lara fight, and granted, Erislandy Lara was aging by this point. He was like in his mid-30s, maybe 36 or something. He's now 38, so yeah, probably 36. This was a super competitive fight. Brian Castano came out hot, man. He puts the pressure on you. He's got a two-handed attack. He's not a tall fighter for the division, so he stays pretty low. He's 5'7.5". Jermell Charlo is 5'11" and 5'11" to 5'7.5". Jermell Charlo has a 73-inch reach compared to Brian Castano's 67-inch reach. But Brian Castano keeps a low construct. Erislandy Lara's got a very long reach for the division. He has a 75.5-inch reach. Even though Lara is shorter than Jermell Charlo by a couple inches, he's got a couple inches more in reach than Jermell Charlo. So Erislandy Lara is a tactical, super strategic, and skilled southpaw. Very crafty. He likes to pick his spots. He moves around the ring a lot and then will settle down and throw his power punches. His straight left hand is beautiful. So Castano didn't care about any of this, at least for the first few rounds. And so I had him winning some of those early rounds against Lara. Lara was able to kind of get Castano to hesitate a little bit by catching him with some nice left hands. And Castano was still competitive in the second half of the fight. Still won a couple of those final rounds, in my opinion. This was a very tough fight to score, and it ended up being a draw. So there you go. This was a case of the pressure fighter, the aggressor with the two-handed attack, coming in against a guy who was trying to pick him off with cleaner shots and trying to blunt some of the attack by, stepping in to smother Castano's punches and then grapple and then separate, so then you could then dictate the terms of the exchange again. But Castano is somebody who, I'll stop short of using the phrase, and Richard Dwyer, online boxing analyst, uses it sometimes, running red lights, in terms of being the aggressor to the point where most fighters will pause because they are aware of the incoming fire that's coming in, and then they'll come in on their attack. Brian Castano isn't reckless enough to where he's going to blow past that and absorb a whole bunch of unnecessary shots. Castano keeps his hands up, which is very important when you're going against a counterpuncher like Jermell Charlo. He keeps his hands up, and he likes to cut the ring off and then let his hands go, especially to the body. I mean, blistering punches, left hooks to the body. You could tell early that Lara was pretty uncomfortable. He really had to fight his ass off to keep this one competitive. And yes, Castano did gas a little bit in the second half of the fight, but he was still, in those moments, at least fighting to a nearly even level with Lara. So that fight resulted in a draw. And then Castano came back to fight Wale Omatoso, stopped him in the 5th round to win a lesser belt, one of those regional-ish or intercontinental belts. And then he challenges Patrick Teshera, the Brazilian who is holding the WBO belt. So Castano fights Teshera for Teshera's WBO belt. This is in February 2021. This was his first fight in over a year. He didn't fight at all through 2020 pandemic. And Castano took the fight to Teshera. I mean, he kind of beat the hell out of Teshera. This was a unanimous decision win. Teshera might have won 1 or 2 rounds. But by the end of this fight, Teshera was kind of moving around and holding on, trying to survive the fight. Because Castano pours it on. If you're not able to, stop the faucet from leaking, he will just rain hell upon you. Pretty relentless. He doesn't have that one punch put you to sleep power, but he hits hard enough to hurt you, and he's relentless and consistent enough in his attack to make your life hell in there. So Castano wins the WBO belt, and that's what he's bringing in against Jermell Charlo, who's bringing in the other 3 belts. So how do I look at this one? I've seen a few transformations in Jermell Charlo's game. It's like he went from sweet science, technical boxer to knockout artist. But recently, again, if you look at that Tony Harrison rematch, he was losing those rounds, and some rounds he was losing pretty badly because Harrison kind of switched up the strategy. In their first fight, Harrison was fighting on his back foot and was fighting a similar fight to the one that John Jackson was fighting when he was taking some of the rounds from Jermell Charlo, where you're moving around the ring, working behind a jab, picking your spots, and just being elusive and kind of skillfully winning the rounds by being economical and letting Jermell Charlo kind of look puzzled and bewildered, trying to figure out this puzzle. Well, in the second fight, Tony Harrison was coming forward and was actually backing Jermell Charlo up. And, Jermell Charlo was getting caught with a lot of straight right hands, too. And Derek James in the corner, you could tell that they were concerned because they felt that Jermell Charlo could be losing a lot of these rounds. And Harrison, again, he was just timing the punches perfectly and just catching Jermell Charlo with straight right hands to where Derrick James is like, hey, you got to keep that left hand up. Jermell Charlo, once the action starts flowing, tends to drop his left hand while he's just looking for his spots to be able to counterpunch with his electrifying, explosive power punches. You know, some people have like really thudding punches, and then some fighters just look electric when they're letting their best punches go. Jermell Charlo's got some of those. But what's been concerning to me is this pattern of Jermell Charlo falling behind on the scorecards, because when you match that up with somebody like Brian Castano, who is basically going to give you hell every round and make you work to win the round, you know, I can see why people think, or a lot of people think, that Brian Castano is going to, you know, win this fight via decision. I mean, it kind of makes sense on paper. You've got somebody who's increasingly become a selective power puncher, even though, you know, that fight against Tony Harrison, that second one that I keep on referencing, that was the only time Jermell Charlo has ever been out-jabbed, at least at that point. It was the only time he'd ever been out-jabbed. And, you know, if you look at the punch stats, he was actually throwing a lot more punches than Tony Harrison, because Tony Harrison seemed to keep him kind of stressed out, because I don't think Jermell anticipated that Tony Harrison was going to fight that style of fight. And, you know, sometimes when you win the fight via knockout, people will forget the struggles that you had prior to the knockout. So, again, there are a lot of reasons because of that evidence that will make you say Brian Castano should win this fight via decision, because Jermell won't be able to consistently keep up with his treadmill pace of fighting. Now, granted, Tony Harrison and Brian Castano are very different fighters. Tony Harrison is like a 6-footer. He was, you know, taller and longer than Jermell Charlo. So Jermell Charlo looked like this shorter fighter who was taking a step back, and then trying to selectively pick his power shots. Whereas Brian Castano is going to be the smaller fighter, shorter fighter at least, against Jermell Charlo, where it's going to be Castano who's staying low and trying to explode with the punches to the body, backing Jermell Charlo up. But as a shorter fighter, not a taller fighter like Tony Harrison. And I don't think Brian Castano is anything really like Jason Rosario, where Rosario is, in many cases, 3 sheets to the wind, just letting his power punches go. We saw that work against him against Erickson Lubin. Yes, he did just badly hurt Lubin in their recent fight a couple weeks ago, but Lubin ended up scoring the knockout, because it turns out now we've seen 3 times that Jason Rosario gets hurt badly or stopped to the body. I think there are some durability issues there. Not in the case of Brian Castano, as far as we could tell. And if you look at the other guys that Jermell Charlo had some real problems with, John Jackson and Tony Harrison the first time, where Tony Harrison was fighting the back foot style of fight, the mover and the jabber, as opposed to the come forward and pressure. I don't see Castano fighting or being able to fight that type of fight with Jermell Charlo, where you're circling and Jermell Charlo can't really find you in the ring and he's, you know, having difficulty winning those rounds. Castano's not going to do that to Charlo. So the question is, how is Charlo going to game plan and handle Brian Castano's style of fighting, the pressure style where you're coming in low and letting your hands go, just trying to make the opposition work? I think that Jermell Charlo and his team should be damn near traumatized by that second fight against Tony Harrison, which, again, they won via knockout. But if you look at the several rounds prior to that, they should be very concerned coming into this fight saying, hey, this guy's going to pressure you. And remember how you felt against Tony Harrison, how difficult that was, where I really feel like Tony Harrison got lackadaisical and showboated and kind of got a little careless in the latest rounds of the fight, which I don't expect Brian Castano to do either. So what would keep me then from saying I'm going to go with, as a prediction, Brian Castano via decision? Because I think here I'm actually going to take Jermell Charlo via decision, which sounds very counterintuitive. It's like, why is the guy who has been having difficulty winning rounds until he scores the knockout beat the proverbial great round winner? You know, some guys will get you out of there, bing, Deontay Wilder, for instance. But Deontay Wilder, as much of a knockout artist as he is the antithesis of a round winner. It's pretty much feast or famine for him. Well, you've got different styles of great round winners, like, Devin Haney and Demetrius Andrade are great round winners through a more technical style. Brian Castano, on the other hand, will just wear you down to a nub. He will just grind you down, keep coming forward, and win the rounds because you're not throwing as many punches as he is, and you're not landing as many punches as he is. So he's going to work you over and win rounds that way. So why would somebody who's having difficulty winning rounds in some of these fights, like Jermell Charlo, win a decision over Brian Castano? And that's because, I think that there's something to be said about certain fighters who just flat out know how to win the fights when the going gets tough. Jermell Charlo seems to me, based on what I've seen, to have a ton of heart, even when he's cognizant and knowing that he might be down on the scorecards. Well, I think he and one of the greatest trainers in the game to me, Derek James, if not the best trainer in the game, certainly one of them, I think that they're going to devise a game plan that's going to work against Brian Castano's pressure style. I think that Jermell Charlo will do a better job at keeping his jab pumping, even though Brian Castano didn't seem to care too much about Erislandy Lara's jab and kind of mowed right through that. I think Jermell Charlo is a better mover at 31 years old than Erislandy Lara was at 36. Once upon a time, like when he fought Canelo Alvarez, Erislandy Lara was a great mover. Not so much in these later stages like against Brian Castano. Jermell Charlo can still move around the ring, and his punches are so damn dangerous, and he is willing to throw combinations. And again, when the going gets tough, he does start throwing more punches than he's accustomed to throwing. He was almost too selective in those fights against the guys who were bewildering him with the movement. John Jackson, Tony Harrison the first time. But when he starts getting pressured, he starts throwing punches more rapidly because it's kind of kill or be killed at that point. You could even look at the Jason Rosario fight and see how Jermell Charlo does with his back against the wall. So I think that Brian Castano is going to press the issue, but I think that Jermell Charlo, instead of breaking and wilting to the pressure, I think that Castano will certainly have his moments and will make this a super, super close and competitive fight, winning some of the rounds. It might even be a disputed or split decision type of fight, but I think that Jermell Charlo will do enough to win some of the rounds based on clean punching, and he'll go to the body too. So Brian Castano is going to get his body tested. So it's not like he's just going to have to worry about headshots. Jermell Charlo likes to change levels. I mean, that's how he caught Erickson Lubin early. He didn't throw that punch up top. He caught him to the face, but it was a low punch that Erickson Lubin just happened to dip into. Erickson Lubin, another shorter fighter with, by the way, a much longer reach than Brian Castano. But Erickson Lubin likes to kind of come down a level. And I think that, at least based on the evidence that we've seen, actually works towards Jermell Charlo's advantage. So even though Castano will have moments where he's working Jermell Charlo over, and I think that Castano, or another orthodox fighter, is going to be throwing that right hand up top after battering him to the body, I think he's going to be going low and punishing him low so that he could go high and start catching him more and more often, because Jermell Charlo does get hit, and we've seen him backed up. Not super badly hurt, but I've seen him where he starts to go back into the ropes and try to, gather himself so that he could come back out and pour it on. Well, I think that he's going to have to go in the trenches here, and he didn't look beautiful doing the trench work against Tony Harrison, but in this fight, he's game planning for Brian Castano's style, and I don't think Brian Castano is going to totally flip the script and start becoming a sweet science move around the ring and work behind a jab type of guy. So I think that Jermell Charlo is going to find enough moments to win enough rounds to where he can eke out a super, super close decision win. And you know what else? I think that he is going to drop Brian Castano. Maybe not to the point where Brian Castano is super rocked and on the brink of getting finished, but I'm talking about one of those balance knockdowns where Castano comes in because he's going to keep on coming in, and those are the types of opportunities that Jermell is looking to counter. Maybe not 24/7 like the way Brian Castano is going to be pouring it on, but he does look for moments if you're going to be coming in to try to catch you with a hard power shot. So I think that he might catch Brian Castano pursuing a little too heavily and knock Brian Castano down once or twice throughout the fight. And I think that a knockdown or two would obviously then tip the scales to enable Jermell Charlo to win a close decision win. Let me know what you think about this fight in the comments. I love the idea of this unification, undisputed fight. And also, who do you think is better out of the two Charlos? I've had mixed opinions, as I've seen their careers unfold over the years. I just want to see Jermell Charlo fight in more of the fights that matter. That's exactly what Jermell Charlo is doing right here. By the way, huge missed opportunity that they weren't able to get the Jermell Charlo versus Jarrett Hurd fight. I would have loved to see that before Jarrett Hurd started losing. He now has 2 losses, and he didn't look good at all in his last fight against Luis Arias. I mean, he did fight his butt off and do everything he could, but man, he just gets hit way too damn much. But yeah, when Jarrett Hurd was in his prime, his style of pressure would have given Jermell Charlo all kinds of hell. But yeah, let me know what you think about Jermell Charlo versus Brian Castano in the comments. This is such a high pressure fight. I mean, so many chips on the line right here. I mean, this is one of those fights where the winner and the loser could have divergent paths after this fight. But I'm just glad that we are seeing one of the fights that truly matter. This, by the way, will be the first undisputed champ, assuming somebody wins and this doesn't result in a draw, right? This will be the first time that somebody is crowned undisputed champ with all the belts at 154 since Winky Wright in 2004. And that was before the 4-belt era. It was only the WBC, WBA, IBF when Winky Wright did it in 2004. Yeah, I can't wait for Jermell Charlo versus Brian Castano. This is going to be a very difficult fight. And, I saw, for instance, Richard Dwyer, online boxing analyst that I mentioned before. He thinks that Brian Castano, or he's at least betting because of the way that the odds are shaped up. I think Brian Castano is a significant enough underdog to where he sees it being worth your while in betting on the Brian Castano side. I don't know who he thinks is going to win the fight straight up, but he was pointing to some of the matchup issues that Jermell Charlo would be having. I tend to agree with some of them, but I do think that Brian Castano will walk into some fire by over pursuing. I'm going Jermell Charlo via close decision win, but please leave your comments in the comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.